After the opening moves d4 and d5, both sides controlling a fair share of the center, white's most ambitious as well as challenging option is to play c4, placing immediate pressure against black's center. Declining the so-called gambit with e6 or c6 are reliable options for black, but another valid option is to play d takes c4. Turning the game into the Queen's Gambit accepted, the focus of this video. We'll learn that the Queen's Gambit is a somewhat misleading name, as black typically doesn't try to hold on to the extra pawn. In most cases, if black doesn't plan on keeping the pawn, what is the point of surrendering central control and allowing white the chance to build a strong two-pawn center with e4? By capturing the c4 pawn, black has opened up the d-file for the queen, creating immediate pressure against the d4 pawn. d4 is an important target for black, which will often be attacked with a future pawn break e5 or c5, increasing the pressure against the d4 pawn. Depending on how white responds to this central pressure will greatly influence how black decides to complete development. Sometimes white can feel worried about the possibility of black playing b5, reinforcing the extra pawn on c4. And as a result, white may play the forcing queen a4 check, attacking the king and c4 pawn at the same time. Black has several ways to respond to this check, including moves such as c6, bishop d7, but a great way to challenge white's early queen excursion is knight c6. Blocking the check while promoting one of black's key ideas in the Queen's Gambit accepted, building pressure against d4. Black is ready to capture the d4 pawn, so it's important for white to defend it with a move such as knight f3, when black can play the active bishop g4, adding pressure against the knight, so indirectly increasing the pressure against d4. Notice that if white decides to play e3, in many lines of the Queen's Gambit accepted, if white does not play an early knight f3, this allows black to play the active counterstrike, e5, intensifying the pressure in the center with the idea that after d takes e5, black can unpin the knight with bishop d7, threatening to capture the pawn with knight takes e5, discovering an attack against the enemy queen. Black enjoys an active position, so the early queen a4 check is not a dangerous option to face. A more promising line to ease white's mind regarding a potential b5 pawn thrust is e3. This is a solid choice for white, reinforcing the d4 pawn while preparing to develop the light-squared bishop and regain material with bishop takes c4. If black tries to hold on to the c4 pawn with b5, reinforcing the c4 pawn, this decision comes at a price, as it weakens the long light-squared diagonal. We can now see a key theme that you may apply in several different positions, responding to b5 with a4. This excellent move undermines b5, the key defender of the c4 pawn. Notice that a6 is not an option, as white can simply play a takes b5, pinning the a6 pawn to black's rook. If black decides to support b5 by playing c6, this allows the classic trap a takes b5. The c4 pawn is once again hanging, and if black plays the natural c takes b5, once again exposing the long light-squared diagonal, white can immediately exploit this with queen f3, attacking black's rook on a8 when black cannot avoid a significant loss of material. Against the solid e3 variation, black can play knight f6, which will often transpose into mainline variations with an early knight f3. If black wants to challenge white's move order, then another interesting choice is the dynamic pawn break e5. The point is, if white captures the pawn with d takes e5, then black can trade queens, preventing white's king from castling, followed by playing knight c6, gaining an active position. A more reliable choice for white is the straightforward bishop takes c4. When black can plan to play against an isolated queen's pawn, another typical Queen's Gambit accepted theme with e takes d4. E takes d4. In the Queen's Gambit accepted, white usually shouldn't be afraid to accept an isolated queen's pawn, which is a long-term static weakness, but it affords white active development, especially with the ability to use open lines on the e and c files. This means white's potential attacking chances should not be underestimated. After e takes d4, one basic setup for black is knight f6, bishop e7, followed by castling the king. But for the interested viewer, you're encouraged to check out the ambitious bishop d6, developing the dark-squared bishop on a more active diagonal. There are plenty of Grandmaster games with this move waiting to be discovered in the Chess.com Opening Explorer. Instead of playing the solid e3, a more ambitious choice is e4, immediately taking space in the center and preparing bishop takes c4. This line is considered one of White's most serious challenges against the Queen's Gambit accepted. If Black does not respond actively, it's all too easy to reach a passive position when White's space advantage and active pieces can take over the game. That being said, e4 is a move that should be respected, but not feared. One drawback to playing e4 is that these central pawns are a little sensitive, especially the d4 pawn, which is no longer supported by another pawn. If you're interested in exploring positions with interesting piece play, then knight f6 or knight c6, attacking White's center, provoking the central pawns forward are definitely worth exploring. Sometimes, Black immediately plays c5. And for those of you willing to accept greater risk, since the e4 pawn temporarily blocks the long light squared diagonal, Black can even consider playing b5, which turns out to be a playable option, although Black has to be well prepared to justify this decision after White's typical a4 response. Once again, without an early knight f3, this invites Black to play the dynamic pawn thrust e5. This is Black's most common response against e4, fighting for central space and increasing the pressure against d4. Grabbing space with d5 allows Black to gain a lead in development, and it also invites Black's dark squared bishop to find activity from the c5 square. White's most popular and challenging response is to continue development and reinforce the center with knight f3. The disruptive bishop b4 check is an interesting option worth exploring, but Black's most popular choice is to remove White's two-pawn center with e takes d4. Instead of immediately reacting to Black's pawn on d4, White can emphasize a lead in development with bishop takes c4. White is willing to sacrifice a pawn to build an early initiative. For example, if Black tries to cement the extra pawn on d4 with c5, Black's kingside remains completely undeveloped, so it's no surprise that White can create a dangerous attack with knight e5. White's active pieces gang up on the weak f7 pawn, so after Black tries to defend the kingside with bishop e6, this allows White to continue the attack with bishop takes e6, f takes e6, inviting the powerful response, queen h5 check. White's temporary material deficit is completely forgotten as Black is forced to return the pawn, with interest, after g6, allowing White to take advantage of the pinned h7 pawn with knight takes g6. H takes g6 allows White to capture the rook on h8, so this is a highly unpleasant position Black should avoid. Instead of playing the greedy c5, Black can definitely consider bishop b4 check, a reasonable option worth exploring. But Black's main continuation is the sensible knight c6, developing a piece, supporting the d4 pawn, and preventing White's threat of knight e5. White continues to focus on active, efficient development by castling. In this common position, Black has played moves such as knight f6, bishop c5, as well as bishop g4. But Black is often concerned with allowing White to play a quick queen b3, building a powerful queen-bishop battery pointing at f7, emphasizing Black's lack of kingside development. It is precisely for this reason that Black's main line is bishop e6, challenging White's light-squared bishop. White has no shortage of interesting ideas. If White wants to increase the tension, then bishop b5, pinning the knight on c6, is an active option to explore. Black will typically respond with bishop c5, supporting the d4 pawn, as well as starting to develop the kingside. Incredible complications can be expected, which will typically reward the better prepared player. If White would prefer to keep the game under greater control, then one option is to support the light-squared bishop in continuing to develop with knight b to d2. And of course, a simple and reasonable path is to accept Black's challenge with bishop takes e6, f takes e6, weakening Black's pawn structure and allowing White to play the double attack queen b3, attacking the unprotected e6 and b7 pawns at the same time. Playing the passive queen c8, trying to hold on to the extra pawn is not advised since Black's kingside remains severely undeveloped. White can then play bishop f4, discouraging a possible e5, as well as adding pressure against the c7 pawn. So Black will have to worry about a disruptive knight g5 to follow. Instead of queen c8, Black should return the extra pawn to focus on much-needed development with queen d7, inviting White to regain the pawn with queen takes b7. Black moves the rook to safety, adding pressure down the b file, and gains a tempo against the queen with rook b8. Queen a6. Black focuses on kingside development with knight f6, adding pressure against the e4 pawn. So white sensibly reinforces the pawn with knight b to d2. Once again, we see the option for black to play bishop b4, preparing to castle, as well as exchanging the dark squared bishop for white's knight on d2. A more popular continuation is bishop d6, pointing toward white's king side, as well as possibly supporting a future e5. One plan for white is to centralize the queen with queen d3, securing the e4 pawn, so white can play knight c4, attacking black's bishop on d6. Moving the queen to d3, however, is not without its own drawbacks, as black can play knight g4, not only adding pressure against white's king side, but also preparing to disturb the queen with knight g to e5, when black definitely has a fair share of counterplay. Instead of playing queen d3, white can address the annoying pressure exerted by black's rook on the b file with b3, or possibly playing a3, preparing to grab space with b4, when the dark squared bishop no longer has to babysit the b pawn. The e4 variation is a very direct, as well as critical test of the queen's gambit accepted, which, as we can see, allows plenty of room for interesting play for both sides. Moving the e-pawn with e3 and e4 are both challenging and respectable options for white. In both cases, this allows black to play the disruptive e5 pawn break. Against the queen's gambit accepted, white's most classical response is knight f3, simply developing while supporting the d4 pawn and discouraging an early e5 pawn break. Black's most natural and flexible response is to play knight f6, making a solid developing move and waiting to see how white responds. The most common continuation is e3, but let's first consider the ambitious knight c3. This simple developing move has a very direct plan, preparing to take over the center with e4. This allows black to transpose into the Slav defense with c6, the Chigorin defense with knight c6, or transpose into a line from the queen's gambit declined with e6. This means that white has to be prepared for several transpositions, but if you want to stay true to the queen's gambit accepted, then you can play a6, challenging white to play e4 when black will support the extra pawn with b5. This may provoke white into playing the inaccurate a4, preventing b5, but allowing black to attack the center with knight c6, when black is prepared to play knight a5, holding on to the c4 pawn and possibly preparing to exploit the weak b3 square. Instead of a4, white needs to embrace the clash of ideas with e4, taking more space in the center and preparing bishop takes c4. So black prevents this idea with b5. This variation can lead to very concrete play. Black is currently up a pawn, but white can challenge black's position with e5, gaining space and removing pressure against e4. But this does open up the d5 square for black's knight. If black is able to comfortably complete development, then the extra pawn may become a serious factor. So once again we see the a4 theme. Adding pressure against black's light-squared pawn chain, white is trying to provoke b4, weakening the c4 pawn. In response to a4, black's most reliable choice is to reinforce the center with e6. When after 8 takes b5, capturing a pawn and pinning the a6 pawn to black's rook. By capturing on b5, white is once again preparing to play the desirable bishop takes c4. One interesting option to explore is bishop b4, adding pressure against the pinned knight. But in one Grandmaster encounter, Grandmaster Vallejo Pons played the instructive knight b6. This is an important idea to keep in mind. The knight protects both the c4 pawn as well as the rook on a8. If white plays b takes a6, black is happy to trade rooks with rook takes a6, as the c4 pawn continues to annoy white's light-squared bishop. If white doesn't play b takes a6, then 8 takes b5, provoking an exchange of rooks on the a file is an interesting option to consider. This variation is an ambitious choice for white, but with careful play, black's position remains quite solid. Instead of knight c3, provoking interesting complications, white's most solid and classical choice is the straightforward e3, supporting d4 and preparing bishop takes c4. By playing knight f3 before e3, the thematic e5 pawn break is no longer an option for black, but the classical knight f3 is not without its drawbacks. Black can now consider playing the active bishop g4, provoking interesting complications. That being said, black's most classical and popular response is the solid e6, supporting the center and opening up the dark-squared bishop, preparing another important pawn break in the queen's gambit accepted, c5. White continues to develop and collects the c4 pawn with bishop takes c4. In typical Queen's Gambit accepted style, black temporarily allows white to build a solid pawn center, only to begin an active counterattack against it with c5, continuing to build pressure against d4. In response to c5, white typically castles the king to safety. Black sometimes decides to relieve the tension in the center with c takes d4, as well as deciding to play knight c6. But a thematic idea in this position is to first play a6, preparing potential queenside expansion with b5 and bishop b7. White has several ways to handle this position, including the prophylactic bishop b3, preparing to meet b5 with a4, arguing that black's queenside expansion is a double-edged decision. If you're interested in playing a safe, simplified position, hoping to grind down your opponent, then d takes c5, offering a queenless middle game, has received some grandmaster attention. All of that being said, white's classical response has been to prevent black's queenside expansion with a4, securing a space advantage, preventing b5, but also weakening the b4 square, which we'll see can become an important theme later in the game. In response to a4, black continues with the plan to increase the pressure against the d4 pawn with knight c6, when a popular plan for white is queen e2, centralizing the queen and preparing to meet c takes d4 with rook d1, pinning the d4 pawn to black's queen. After black's solid response bishop e7, white accepts the isolated queen's pawn with e takes d4. Black now takes the chance to castle the king. White continues to sensibly develop with knight c3, preparing to remove the isolated pawn and opening up the position for white's better developed forces with d5. One popular response for black is to play knight d5, blockading white's isolated queen pawn. Another interesting response is knight b4, taking advantage of the weakened b4 square in order to discourage white's d5 ambitions. In addition to the idea of supporting a knight blockade on d5, the knight on b4 also prevents white's bishop from moving to the b1 to h7 diagonal, a dangerous attacking position for that piece. One drawback to the placement of the knight on b4 is that if white is able to clear the third rank of knights with moves such as knight e5 and knight e4, then rook a3, swinging the rook to the king side with rook h3 or rook g3, supporting a kingside attack could be a future danger for black. This typical isolated queen pawn position showcases the classical ideas behind the Queen's Gambit accepted, building a solid position and fighting against white's isolated queen's pawn. Naturally, white is not without resources, enjoying a space advantage as well as active pieces, which is exactly why you can find a wealth of classical grandmaster games that have debated this structure for decades. As long as black doesn't play the Queen's Gambit accepted with the main intention of trying to win a pawn, this is a solid, classical system employed by countless grandmasters as well as world champions. Black typically accepts a space disadvantage, preparing to energetically counterattack white's center with plenty of chances for both sides. Thanks for exploring the Queen's Gambit accepted, and best of luck if you find yourself playing with or against this classical opening.